Ah, yes, role-playing games. You can find them anywhere. Steam, the PlayStation Store, your kids' Halloween candy, or the Nintendo eShop. But what are they, and what's up with all those variants that people keep arguing over on Reddit and in the YouTube comments? At their core, role-playing video games are based on old-school tabletop RPGs like Dungeons and Dragons. They include exploration, puzzles, and combat. There's this sense of a world beyond just what the player is doing, and a lot of that world will be discovered via the exploration mechanics. That world is going to have plenty of non-playable characters, or NPCs, and it's typically going to be in a sci-fi or fantasy setting, although there are exceptions, such as Shenmue. RPGs are completed after finishing a series of quest lines or one main story. However, what really makes an RPG is the existence of a leveling system, where the playable characters improve their abilities and stats as they gain levels. This system is colloquially referred to as RPG mechanics. Moving past all that, there's also a seemingly infinite amount of RPG subgenres that each have their own unique features. I'm going to ignore most of them for two reasons. One is that this video would be far too long, and the other is because with the information in this video, you should be able to piece together what the sweaty internet gremlins mean when they say FPS RPG, action JRPG, or isometric dungeon crawler, open world adventure simulation TRPG anyways, so it's really just not worth it.
I can't explain how it's the thesis of the whole.
I'll start with the biggest divide, JRPGs versus Western RPGs. Starting with JRPGs, J stands for Japanese, but not every RPG made in Japan is a JRPG. JRPGs are just a specific type of RPG that was popularized in Japan. They focus more on the narrative, which is more often only one main storyline. They tend to have a more animated art style. The story's characters are generally going to be pre-existing characters that you're not able to customize, and these characters will most likely include multiple protagonists in a party, all of which you can control in turn-based combat. Some examples of JRPGs include Final Fantasy, Pokemon, Phantasy Star, and the Tales series. Western RPGs have the opposite of everything I just listed with the JRPGs. Not to say that Western RPGs don't have good stories, but they tend to focus on world building over narrative. And more often than not, there are multiple quest lines rather than just one. The graphics tend to be more realistic, the main character is one that you're able to customize to a certain extent, and there isn't usually more than one main character or protagonist. The combat is action-oriented instead of turn-based, and some examples of Western RPGs include The Elder Scrolls, The Witcher, Mass Effect, and Fallout. The C in CRPG stands for computer. This title doesn't tell you much, so they're also sometimes referred to as old school RPGs. They are some of the oldest RPGs that exist, but there's plenty of newer CRPGs as well. They typically have an isometric view, focus on gameplay and immersion over graphics. The core gameplay tends to put an emphasis on exploration, character progression, problem solving, and battle tactics, because the combat is usually real-time pausable or turn-based. Some examples of CRPGs are Divinity Original Sin, Disco Elysium, Baldur's Gate, and Pillars of Eternity. The A in ARPG stands for action. This term is used in two different ways from what I've gathered. It's usually either tacked on to a different RPG type in order to explain that the combat is real-time instead of turn-based. So Scarlet Nexus could be described as an action JRPG because it has action-oriented combat, unlike a lot of other JRPGs. However, the term action RPG is also a genre in and of itself. The genre is obviously more combat-focused with real-time combat. Combat systems in this genre include hack and slash, shooter, and beat 'em up. This is the most popular RPG genre nowadays, and the term FPS RPG would also fall under this category. Examples of ARPGs include Monster Hunter, Diablo, Path of Exile, and The Elder Scrolls 4 and 5. Soulslike games are a subcategory of action RPGs. They're sometimes referred to as Soulsborne games too, because the genre was started by and is based on From Software titles like Dark Souls and Bloodborne. Just like their parent category, they focus mainly on combat. However, Souls-like games seem to focus even more on combat, if that makes sense. Like, they completely revolve around it. They also have a dark fantasy setting and a very hard difficulty. Examples are obviously going to be stuff by From Software like Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Elden Ring, Sekiro, and Demon Souls. TRPG and SRPG stands for tactical and strategy role-playing games respectively. Just like the ARPGs, they have an emphasis on combat. but they have a different combat system. That system is turn-based or real-time tactical combat, which is often on an isometric grid. These games also tend to de-emphasize exploration, but of course that's not always the case. Examples of strategy RPGs include Fire Emblem, Final Fantasy Tactics, Shining Force, and Valkyria Chronicles. Dungeon crawlers see you navigate through a labyrinth/dungeon while fighting monsters, finding treasure, solving puzzles, and avoiding traps. This term can be a bit vacuous because really the vast majority of RPGs include some sort of dungeon crawl aspect to them, so it tends to only be used when it's a core aspect of the gameplay. Examples of dungeon crawlers include Diablo, Borderlands, Minecraft Dungeons, and Enter the Gungeon. Next, we have roguelikes, which are also dungeon crawlers most of the time. They include things like permanent death and randomly generated worlds. The main focus is on combat and exploration. The combat in older roguelikes was nearly always turn-based. However, in more recent years, this is becoming less and less common. Roguelikes are basically just miniature RPGs that you can play through in one sitting. Examples include Toe Jam and Earl, Fatal Labyrinth, The Binding of Isaac, and Risk of Rain. And finally, the last one I'm going to cover in this video is Roguelites. They're nearly identical to Roguelikes, except they feature a leveling or progression system and sometimes a story outside of the normal runs. In Vampire Survivors, for example, you can collect gold throughout your run. Then once you die, you can buy a bunch of different upgrades, including the Wings upgrade, on the menu screen. Now in your next run, you'll be able to move a bit faster or do a little bit more damage depending on what upgrades you bought outside of the run. So it's basically an out-of-game RPG system that can help you do your mini RPGs better. Examples of roguelites include Hades, Dead Cells, Vampire Survivors, and Cult of the Lamb. This video is meant to sort of get the general feel of each RPG genre. Keep in mind that for a game to be considered part of one of these genres, they don't need to have every single characteristic I mentioned. In fact, they can be missing quite a few and still fit the bill. In more recent years, games have really begun to blur the lines and push the boundaries of these genres, and there's a lot of disagreement over these definitions. It's not an exact science. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one.